Hello, I'm Dr. Meredith Martin and I'm the Director of the Pathways to Politics Program for Women based at the University of Melbourne. I'd like first to acknowledge the traditional owners of the different lands on which this interview is taking place and pay respects to elders and families, in particular the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples, who are the traditional owners of the land from which I am joining you. The Pathways to Politics Program for Women is a national, proudly non-partisan initiative that aims to change the face of politics by equipping women with the skills, knowledge, confidence and networks they need to get elected and to thrive as political leaders. I'm delighted to welcome Jen Overbeck today to speak with us about political leadership. Jen is Associate Professor at the Melbourne Business School. Her research focuses on the effects of power and status on interpersonal and group dynamics, how hierarchies develop, how leaders can bolster their images, and how emotions and communication patterns affect negotiations. Jen's research has been published in Psychological Science, Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Huffington Post, New York Times, USA Today, and Harvard Business Review, amongst many others. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks, Meredith. It's great to be here to talk about a topic I'm really passionate about. We obviously need a lot more smart, competent, effective women in politics and in meaningful ways. And so it's a real privilege to be able to discuss that with you.
We're so grateful to have access to your expertise, Jen. And I'd like to start by asking you to reflect on the particular challenges and constraints faced by women in the context of political leadership, and perhaps offer some examples of female political leaders who you feel have overcome these challenges and constraints effectively.
Yeah, great. It's a great thing to start talking about. I'd like to say that boy, those challenges are going away. You know, historically, there have been so many issues for women, and we're really coming into our own now, and things are changing. And although I think that that's true, it's despite the challenges that still exist, not because the challenges are going away. So there are a couple of things I think women who are drawn to roles of political leadership have to grapple with. One of them is that the expectations of political leaders typically are defined around strength. So, you know, people look for somebody who can win a fight, who can win an argument, and sometimes somebody who can be a brawler in political context. And all of that is somewhat inconsistent with the image of what it is to be a good woman. So sort of inherently, to compete in that kind of an environment, a woman has to choose between whether to live up to those expectations of her political strength or the expectations of her as a woman. And I think, you know, we can think back to some of what Julia Gillard experienced when she was in the PM role. And so much criticism happened about her as a woman and whether she was really being what a woman should be. That I think the conversation got a little bit hijacked by that at times. Somebody who I think does that really well, handles those issues really well, might be Jacinda Ardern, who we see, I think, kind of embracing that role as somebody who cares deeply, who shows her emotions, and who is enormously empathetic in the way that she approaches her leadership. And she can show strength and she can show steeliness, but she always does it, even when she's being strong, even when she's trying to give a strong message. She does it with this clear acknowledgement and embrace of that compassionate part of herself. You know, I think it's a balance that's very hard for a lot of women to pull off. And typically women have to make a choice between those two extremes. Angela Merkel, I'm going to give you one more example. Angela Merkel is somebody who I think has navigated that balance by leaning much more into the competence, by saying, look, I'm not going to be a warm, touchy-feely person. Yes, I'm female, but maybe I'm a little bit more like the stern teacher or the aunt. And I'm citing stereotypes on purpose. purpose, because it's almost like women have to choose which image of womanhood they want to embody, and then as long as that's acceptable, then they can engage in their political position. So much of what I'm saying, even as it comes out of my mouth, it's a little bit galling to me that this is the kind of thing that women in politics have to be thinking about, and that we have to choose or stereotype. But nonetheless, it's something, people's expectations and the mismatch in those expectations between what it is to be female and what it is to be a strong leader do pose a challenge. And I think it helps women to navigate that really consciously and deliberately, instead of just thinking everything's going to be fine, not giving it a thought, and then suddenly being confronted with how somebody else chooses to portray us.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were talking about Jacinda Ardern, and they were great examples, by the way, I was thinking about how she's rewritten those tropes to some extent by, I guess, connecting strength to kindness. And I think she's actually used that word to define her own kind of strength and her own kind of strength in leadership, which I think is really interesting. And I guess without essentializing that necessarily as a sort of a deeply feminine trait, which is compelling and helpful, I think, for those who follow. I know you're interested in the activity of leading too, without necessarily occupying a formal leadership role or position. And I wonder if you could unpack for us your understanding of power and influence in this context.
Absolutely. I should probably start by defining my terms the way I use them a little bit. And, I'm an academic, so we like to slice and dice terms. I'm not going to be quite as pedantic as many of my colleagues in this space might be. But when we talk about power and influence, I do distinguish between power, which is, so it's the ability to get things done. And it's the ability to get things done specifically through controlling resources, controlling things that other people want. So power gives you the ability to get things done regardless of what other people think about them, and sometimes even over their opposition. Then we can distinguish that from influence, which is the ability to get things done, but with and through other people. So with influence, we're harnessing their willingness, we're harnessing their energy, and we're getting them on board to carry out and make whatever changes or progress it is that we're trying to make. And then you use the term leadership. And I think when we talk about leadership, we're sort of moving up a level. We're talking about being able to put forth a vision, promote that vision, get people on board, and kind of align people so that their energy is all moving in one direction to accomplish things. So we're getting people to rally around that vision. We're setting the way forward. We can all move forward together. And look, you can rally people. You can make things happen. You can do that alone, but when it comes to politics, I think the key thing we're trying to accomplish is to do that through others. It's very difficult as a political leader to act unilaterally and to have the kind of power you can simply make things happen by yourself. And you don't have to have a formal position. So when you talk about the activity separate from the role, you don't have to have a formal position. That's what community organizing is all about, right? I remember I lived in Boulder, Colorado many years ago. And while I lived there, I served on the citizen board that governed the Parks and Recreation function. So we oversaw decisions like where would a basketball court go, or what would the hours be of the recreation center, or will the changing rooms have privacy dividers, things like that. And one of the things I was young at the time, and it was very eye-opening to me to realize how much a single citizen could have power in what happened in the city based on that person deciding to show up for our meetings, deciding to speak during public comment periods, maybe going to their neighbors and getting them to come out to meetings or to write letters and emails, talking to the media, sending letters to the editor, there were individuals in the city who decided that something mattered to them, and they spoke up. And you know what, honestly, they made a lot of noise. And part of it was that we understood they were not going to go away quietly. We needed to engage with them. We needed to listen to them, and we needed to take their concerns into account in a way that changed our decisions, because otherwise they were just always going to be there in front of us, talking at us yet again. So it was a real education in the fact that power lives in the activity, it lives in the energy, it lives in showing up, it lives in speaking. And nobody has to give you a position to allow you to do that. We had a position. The city council had a position. The mayor had a position. And yet that one individual citizen might have made a lot more change in a particular issue than any of us did.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, given that that power rests on influencing others, it is incumbent upon the person who has formal leadership to listen, or at least to be seen to listen. So there's a kind of power that resides in that for, I guess, more grassroots advocacy. I think that's
I would say
model.
Apologies. Yeah, I think it's one of the things that distinguishes really effective leaders too. So I do think there is a fair number of people who conceive of leadership, conceive of power, and in particular conceive of political office as an opportunity to maybe be free of other people's constraints and to start to do things that we've wanted to do. Now I have the power to do it. And it's I think confronting for many people to arrive in a position of power and realize that they're one of many. If somebody who's a mayor will be limited by other counselors or by the community or by the business community, that's a significant source of constraint. A premier, a PM, they're constrained by other government leaders as well as the public, the media. So there's always constraint. In fact, one of the most extreme examples I know of, there's an Italian journalist who about 20 years ago interviewed 7 notorious world dictators and asked them questions about the choices they had made and the actions they had taken, some of which were quite horrible. I mean, he's talking to people who engaged in murder and cannibalism and, political purges and that sort of thing. And 2-1, every single one of these people expressed in some form that I had no choice. I didn't want to do these things. I knew these were bad things to do, but my lieutenants, my public, the competitors in the region, they left me no other choice but to engage in these actions. And, of course, that's extreme, and they were self-delusional and they're justifying horrible things. But that extreme example, I think, helps us to see just how much power never gives you perfect ability to do exactly what you want to do. There's always the perception and the reality of constraints from other people. And so I think coming to understand that the true power, the true influence lives in our ability to step up to the challenge and to engage in the action, I think is just so valuable.
Oh, and that's a great segue to my next question. How might political aspirants begin to identify their own philosophy of power and influence? What are some of the costs and benefits of different models, I guess, of power and influence?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Recently, I've been doing quite a lot of research in this area. And one of the things that I've really discovered or found stimulating is the notion that there are really a couple of different models of power that people tend to embrace. And what I find exciting about that is that we often think of power in very negative terms. And people judge political leaders sometimes in fairly negative and cynical terms. And yet, of course, we have to have power and we have to have politics. Like, as human beings living in societies, these are necessary things. So are we just always dealing with a necessary evil? And with the research, I think, going back decades, if not centuries, highlights is that there are different models of power, and individuals have different lay theories or different individual ways of approaching power. And those seem to fall out into two. So there's a relatively coercive form of power, and that's what the dictators do. But we also see this with normal people who aren't dictators and aren't exercising absolute power. But if you see the world as kind of fundamentally competitive, dog eat dog, kill or be killed sort of thing, then you're going to have a more coercive view of power. And what that says is, I need to exert dominance. I need to instill some fear. I need to be very absolute in the way I impose my will, because if I fail to do that, it leaves an opening for somebody else to move in and seize that advantage instead. And I don't necessarily have to have ill intent. So I can have a belief that this is how power works. And what I want to do is protect people. I want to serve people. And yet, because I believe that this is the nature of power, I think somebody else might come in with a much more malevolent intention. And so I have to play a dirty game to stop them, right? So if that is my view, then I'm going to tend to engage in these kinds of gamesmanship activities. I'll be more secretive with information. I'll be less transparent. I'll try to take out my enemies. And I may be, again, doing this for very valid, lofty purposes. But what power looks like as a result is pretty negative. And it does have costs. So you talked about the cost of different approaches to power. That approach to power can be enormously successful in the short term, but it typically inspires people to resist. It inspires organized resistance, and even in some cases, revolution, large or small. A revolution could be at a national level, or it could be a leadership spill, right? So we can see negative responses to people who tend to use their power too coercively. But on the other hand, you're very well suited for dealing with other people's gamesmanship and other people's negative actions. So I'll take a pause. I can talk about the more positive view too, but I just want to see if there's anything you wanted to follow up on before I do.
No, I think that's really interesting, because it's that whole notion of creating the world according to your own vision. So I'd love to hear the more sort of generous and generative version of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, so the alternative to that coercive power is what we will call collaborative power. And the notion behind collaborative power is that I recognize that anything that I want to do, my resources, my capacity to implement that thing are going to be limited unless I can harness the energy of a lot of other people. And in order for me to harness that energy, in order for me to convince other people that it is worth their time and energy to get involved, I have to offer them something in exchange. And so the basis of my power is that I can show competence and I can deliver value to the group. So I can do things for others. And it's that promise or that realization of the value that I can deliver that inspires other people to then line up behind me and give me their energy and give me their support and use their own efforts to drive the agenda forward. And so this collaborative power, it has some vulnerabilities. It relies on other people. You have to keep the coalition together. So if I can give an example from outside of Australia right now, I think in the US, the Republicans and the Democrats are a pretty good illustration of relying on coercive and collaborative power, respectively. So I think you can see in a lot of recent legislative efforts by the Republicans, there's an effort to have state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans able to overturn a popular vote. So that's a pretty coercive power tactic that says we're going to unilaterally impose our will and seize an office that the public might have voted differently for. It's kind of a scary thing. I'll leave that aside, but it's a very clear example of a coercive approach to power. And meanwhile, what the Democrats are trying to do is to preserve the ability for different voices to have a role in the party. You can see how Joe Biden is dealing with these two very fractious senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who are Democrats, but are not always towing the party line. So Joe Biden could take a very coercive approach of imposing sanctions or penalties on them when they don't support the party. But what he's doing instead is trying to respect their individual voices and inspire them to collaboratively go with the party and hold the party together. And you can see how challenging it is to try to maintain a collaborative approach to power when you have these people who want to go off as individuals and do quite different things. And so that's why in the short term, it's much harder to be effective with a collaborative power strategy. It's much harder to keep your alliance, your coalition together and keep people from defecting even in small ways so that you can get what you need. But in the longer term, it's much less likely to create that resistance, to create that resentment, to create the risk of an overall, overturning of the power system. And so it has a lot of potential. And you can really, I think, you can govern in a way that respects the entire body politic, certainly in a way that coercive power doesn't, but it's a lot more challenging to do while you're doing it.
Yeah, and I guess it starts to become a kind of endless negotiation, an endless series of negotiations that I mean, I was just thinking about your emphasis on coercive power as being effective in the short term, but then, of course, not in the long term, or not necessarily in the long term, although we've certainly seen it across the long term. But I guess collaborative power, exhaustive though it may be in terms of that endless negotiation, has the potential, once there's a kind of genuine activity, for it to be more long lasting.
Yeah. And I mean, really the key, so there's a political philosopher, Bertrand Russell, who laid out a very lovely model of power. And one of the things that one of his key insights that I think is very valuable is that there is a sort of life cycle of power. And so we tend to move over time from a more coercive kind of power to a more collaborative kind of power. And the key to that at the political level is that collaborative power becomes institutionalized as legitimate. And you no longer have to control people. So Republicans want to overturn elections because it's difficult for them to win elections given their positions. So they would have to invest a lot of time and energy to win people over and potentially change their positions to get those votes. So instead, there's imposing the party's will on the citizenry. If they succeeded at that, then they would be able to institutionalize their rule and make it legitimate so that they no longer had to overturn elections through official discourse, through the media, through education. They would be able to make what they wanted to have happen legitimate so that people would spontaneously and voluntarily support it. But any legitimate system, whether it's rooted in coercion or whether it comes from a true sense of collaboration, over time, it too can fracture. What is seen to be a legitimate interest, whose interests are served, over time, different things are valued. We're seeing that on the left right now. I think there are fissures within the left about whose interests are prioritized. A lot of lip service is given to women, to members of historically underrepresented groups. And that lip service isn't always accompanied by substantive action. There's now an insistence that action has to happen. And what that means is that groups that have traditionally been advantaged by the power structure are going to lose some advantage in order for that balancing to occur. Well, those groups might then lose confidence in the legitimacy of the system. And so that leads to some vulnerability of institutional legitimacy. And so over time, that might turn back into a more coercive form of power. So I said, coercive forms of power can work very well in the short term, and legitimacy, collaborative power has more robustness over the long term, but ultimately they're both bounded. Ultimately, it's always a balancing process. It's always a negotiation. Maintaining power is a lot of work. I guess in some ways that's the bad news. You don't just get to elected office and get to sit back and do all the great things. You still have to keep doing the work. But I think that's good. I think that helps. It should help remind our leaders to maintain some humility and to remember that there will always be work to do throughout the political career.
Oh, absolutely. And it's always contingent, contingent.
Yeah.
I want my last question, and I could really talk with you about this all day, but I just wondered if you could provide some concrete advice on how political aspirants might identify their own resources and capacity for influencing.
Yeah. That's such a great question, because I think that people have many more resources available to them than they may give themselves credit for. And it's so important to recognize what's available to you that can help bolster your power. And just as an editorial comment before I go into what those look like, I always want to urge people, and women in particular, to be looking for ways to expand power. It seems somewhat ugly to talk about wanting more power, but always remember that power is the ability to get things done. And we want to get things done. And power versus influence is the ability to get things done on your own. And although, yes, we want to be collaborative, we want to inspire people, we want to bring them with us, we also, as women, need to amass enough power that somebody cannot simply tell us you can't do that. To go back to Julia Gillard, I think one of the very confronting things about her situation was that finally we have a woman in the position of PM, but there were a whole lot of men putting a lot of energy to making sure that she couldn't actually use the power in her position. And I think women consistently confront the reality in all sorts of positions, in business positions, university positions, government positions, that we reach a position that should be associated with power, but that power is limited. So let's think about how to augment our power so that we're not limited in what we can accomplish. So what does that look like? I think first and foremost, what everybody immediately goes to is money. And of course, money matters. Of course, when you have more money, it is helpful and you can make some things happen, but it is not the only thing. The next thing that I would want people to think about is people. So there's human capital, there's social capital. I talked about the individuals coming out in Boulder to speak to the Parks Board or to the council. And can you get people to turn out? Can you get them to write letters? Can you organize a phone bank? Can you organize people to go out and hold signs on the street? I mean, look, I'm not a big fan of the anti-vax and anti-lockdown protests, but let's do acknowledge that a very small percentage of the population supported those protests, and yet they had a disproportionate effect. They, I think, arguably led to some changes in the timeline for relaxing of restrictions, even in Victoria, which it had a very strong anti-COVID program. So I think if you have the ability to turn people out, if you have the ability to raise voices, many voices in concert behind a message, then that is an enormous source of power. And I think that people should really take a look at that and appreciate their ability to work their relationships. And honestly, again, without being essentialist, because I really appreciate that you brought that up, I do think that's often a skill that women have in spades and disproportionate to the skill that men have. And so that's really something that we can look at as a source of strength for ourselves. But there's more. There are things like psychological capital. So maybe you can keep your cool when others are melting down, or maybe again, something that is embedded in the kind of relational socialization that many women receive is the ability to understand what's happening with other people and what they're trying to communicate and how they're responding to something. And when we can read that and calibrate that, you can really use that in forming your own political message and understanding how to respond to the public more effectively. So I think that's really, really important. There's intellectual capital in the sense that you are really smart, or maybe you just have access to smart people, or you can hire smart people who understand strategy, understand tactics, have expertise in substantive areas. Like those are all things that really, really matter as well. And again, I distinguish between power. So you control these resources. These are things that other people need, and you get to determine how much other people have access to them. And then there's the influence piece, bringing others on voluntarily, which you can again build through your psychological capital, your social capital, your ability to present yourself as somebody worthy of respect, to claim status, to demonstrate your legitimacy, to have competence in a situation. All of those things really help. And then some of your behaviors, such as openness, transparency, explaining an issue and respecting somebody's ability to engage in that issue and come to a good conclusion when you share the information that they need to reach that conclusion. Those are things that we can all do, and they take some confidence in ourselves to exercise all of these sources of power. But if we accept that we are somebody who's entitled to act, that we have a vision, we can accomplish things. And if we go forth and use that power and use that capacity to influence others, that's a legitimate thing to do. That's something that we deserve to do. And we can make a difference that will help others when we do that. That getting that straight inside of ourselves, I think, just leads to a strength. It leads to conveying a strength outside that can make us more effective too.
Absolutely. And before signing off, I want to encourage anyone who's listening to really think very carefully, as Jen has suggested, about what might be your sources and resources. What capital do you have? And jot it down. And as Jen's suggesting, take confidence from it. I think that's and really think about, I love that notion of harnessing energy through finding your own energy, I think is a wonderful message. That's about all we've got time for, Jen. And can I just thank you so deeply for making time to have this conversation and for making your thoughts and reflections and indeed your considerable research in this area available to so many. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.